Ni hao ma, wo de ming si shi, Daniel. Nah, I'm just kidding. I'm not even Chinese. I'm Korean. Now, if you're watching this, you've probably already seen this video right here.
The changing world order.
And if you haven't, well, let me summarize it for you in 30 seconds by saying the changing world order is the idea that every great empire has their rise and their fall. The rise, according to Ray Dalio, typically includes peaceful and prosperous periods of great creativity and productivity that raises living standards, while the fall includes depression, revolution, and war periods when there's a lot of fighting over wealth, power, and a lot of destruction of wealth, life, and other things that we cherish. And by the way, that's all straight from Ray's book, The Changing World Order, which personally I thoroughly enjoyed. And of course, like many of you, I too also saw Ray's video on the Changing World Order, and well, there was one part that scared me the most.
And the only things that change are the clothes the characters wear and the technologies they use.
And that part happened at minute 39, second 24. Now I know this is madly specific, but this is the part where Ray pretty much says it's inevitable that China will one day overthrow the US as the world's #1 superpower. And well, as somebody who immigrated to this country at just 5 years old, believing that the United States was the #1 country in the world, and as long as I work hard, I can make something of myself and also create generational wealth for me and my family. Oh gosh, Nick, you wouldn't by any chance happen to be cutting onions, would you? And truth be told, the thought of the US experiencing a major downfall points towards a potential world where future generations may not have the same opportunities that you and I have right now. And well, that really disappoints me.
And my day is ruined.
Now, I'm not one to disagree with Ray Dalio. I mean, heck, I wouldn't even disagree with his alter ego, Ray Dalio. And yes, that's actually a real person. But in this video, I'm going to discuss why I'm still skeptical of the idea of China one day becoming the world's #1 superpower at the expense of the US's downfall. Now with that said, here's a brief summary of what Ray Dalio said, starting with the potential decline of the US and its dollar. Now, Ray defines the main signs of an empire experiencing its downfall with internal economic weakness, civil and social divide, and large debts. This eventually leads to a scenario where the empire can no longer borrow the money, and because of this, it experiences major financial downturns, especially if it's around the same time of a major war. And while this causes major domestic unrest in many different forms, whether it be inflation, civil disputes, protests, you name it. Sounds pretty familiar to me. Now, the way this devalues the currency is that during this time, governments feel the pressure and, well, they decide to do what they always do. Print a crap ton of money and blame the consequences on the next guy. And this is where we're at right now, because as a matter of fact, as of December of 2021, 80% of all US dollars in existence have been printed since January of 2020. And really, over the last 60 years or so, our dollar has been slowly losing its value. And this is where we have to be really careful. As a matter of fact, Ray points towards the Soviet Union as a potential scenario for the United States, as the Soviet Union during the 80s found themselves in a situation where they had a really tough time financially supporting their empire, their economy, and also their military all at the same time. And with financial strain of upholding its empire and economy, well, this provided the perfect opportunity for President Reagan to really capitalize on the Soviet Union inability to spend more money on its military.
There goes 10 million bucks in taxpayer money.
Making the US the clear alpha dog of the world. Now what's great is that we talked about this on our channel many times before, and here it is right in front of us. And the example that we use time and time again is how the US rose very quickly on the backs of free market principles fueled by capitalism, and well, eventually as the government got bigger, it began to steward more resources away from the free market, thus creating a system where the domestic economy was propped up by piles and piles of printed money and debt to appease the masses of voters. Now, before we move forward, I want to be extremely clear. Capitalism isn't perfect. As a matter of fact, capitalism created the biggest wealth gap that we've ever seen in our country. And unfortunately, that's what happens when capitalism goes unchecked by free market principles. Because at the end of the day, free market principles create competition and a platform where innovation can thrive. But oftentimes when big government policy interrupts free market principles, well, it creates a scenario where we've seen this time and time again, where a nation will begin to accrue a mountain of debt. And this goes back to the devaluing of our currency, where as the lifespan of our country, the dollar necessarily hasn't seen the best trajectory. And speaking of trajectory, for the last 30 years, we've really seen history repeat itself with the rise of China. Now, in talking about China's rise, Ray Dalio outlined two major phases that occurred before its recent massive economic expansion. The first phase was between the years 1949 to 1976, and this was known as the building the foundation phase, where China's Communist Party took over with Mao Zedong at the helm, and the focus was merely nationalizing the banking system while creating internal infrastructure. The second phase, which occurred between the years 1978 and 2012, was actually opening up the Chinese economy to the outside world for the sake of learning and improving, but also for trading as well. This is really when China started having and building diplomatic relationships with the US. And what's interesting to me personally is that this is where China also started incorporating bits and pieces of capitalism, all for the sake of growing the Chinese economy as fast as possible. And this is what brings us to 2012, where a man by the name of Xi Jinping came to power, and since 2012 up until now, China's economic growth has been skyrocketing. And this was done through many different ways. For one, the Xi administration pursued major reforms to continue to open up Chinese markets while getting tighter control on regulation. And to be clear, the Chinese government at this point did not want any businesses that weren't state-aligned to succeed. As a matter of fact, they denied support such as credit availability to small and medium businesses while offering significant amounts of support to large state-owned enterprises. They even instituted rules and boundaries that pressured banks and businesses to make unwise fiscal decisions that hurt them but helped the Chinese state government. And they went as far as writing up separate laws that foreign businesses would have to abide by compared to Chinese state-owned businesses. So with that said, of course, the big question is, well, what now? What about the year 2022 and moving forward? Well, in talking about the future, according to Ray Dalio, there are two things that he brings attention to. Number one, the US dollar will continue to devalue slowly until a certain period of time where the dollar will devalue rapidly. And this will bring on extreme financial downturns. Dare I say, a depression. Spirit Airlines, here I come.
Ain't no seatbelts on here. That's why we call this Spirit. You gonna pray up here. Sit down.
And the second thing that Ray brought attention to is that right now the US is currently at a 30% possibility of a civil war. And well, based on how things are going, that number is probably going to get higher. Now, when talking about the future, I like to add how important it is to monitor what's happening right now with Russia. Reason being is that due to recent sanctions, along with certain Russian banks being kicked out of SWIFT, Russian companies and banks are turning to China's currency, the yuan, aka the renminbi. And depending on what occurs as the aftermath, the US dollar could be in major trouble. But for now, here's why I'm still skeptical of China being the #1 world superpower, at least in the short-term future. Because in order for that to happen, it would require, for one, more nations to hold the yuan more than just theoretically Russia, and number two, for China to have the world's #1 military that backs its domestic and international currency, which, by the way, China currently doesn't even come close to the US in defense spending, and number three, the world's global trade system to solely rely on the yuan as opposed to the US dollar. Which, hey, if China continues to be the manufacturing powerhouse of the world, that might be the case. Although, I think India and Africa may have something to say about that. And on top of all that, China's economic growth really came on the back of a highly leveraged real estate market. Now granted, the economic growth that the US occurred between the year 1990 and 2008 was also financed by debt. However, we all know how that ended up. And well, this means that according to Ray's logic, China is due for a major economic downturn. Now here's what's really interesting is that as opposed to the yuan or the renminbi being the world's reserve currency one day, or even the dollar, well, we may one day have something like a Bitcoin or any type of digital currency manufactured by a world government as the world currency, not the dollar, not the yuan. Now, if China does rise to become the world's #1 superpower, I predict it will be more like Britain and not the United States. Because the US's rise came from free market innovations powered by capitalism and not forced political governance like Great Britain did. Now, with all that said, I will say this, and this is probably a quote that many of you have probably heard before, and I think this is a perfect summation of what's happening in the United States right now. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. And right now here in the US, well, we're at that point in history where good times are creating weak men, and those weak men will eventually create sucky times. As a matter of fact, some may say it's happening right now. On top of that, honestly, think about the simplest thing. Think about how easily people are offended nowadays. I hate to say it, but it seems that's where we're at in this country, where people will get triggered by the smallest things while big decisions are being made right under our noses without our input. And by the way, this isn't me calling out a certain group of people, but it's more so that this division, all these small things that we're arguing over, well, there's some pretty important things that are being missed because of it. For example, right now everyone's complaining about gas prices. Well, maybe that's because a couple years back, everyone was trying to decide how many genders that we actually have. All the while, the Biden administration made major moves and major decisions that made our country less energy independent. So if there's ever an angle on how the United States of America will one day not be the world's greatest superpower, well, there's my take. And that's why I love what we talk about in this channel, because it promotes financial independence and awareness. So with that said, let me know your thoughts on this video in the comment section below. Like this video and also share this video with your friends. And if you're feeling extra generous, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And until then, I'll see you guys in the next one.